Hello and welcome to this week's Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's current affairs programme. I'm Emma Webb, and this week I am joined by the director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle, as well as the New York Times best-selling author and journalist Andy Ngo. This week we're going to be talking about Elon Musk's decision to take over Twitter, as well as Google Doc's decision to launch an assisted writing tool that helps to make people's language more inclusive and gender neutral. So first, shall we start with you, Andy? Would you like to tell our viewers a little more about who you are and your work and your groundbreaking journalism?
Yes, well, first, thank you for having me here.
Welcome to the show.
It's my first time. I'm an American journalist. I think my detractors would have described me as a far-right provocateur, but in reality, I'm actually a pretty plain and boring dissident journalist.
Boring in that jacket? Come on.
Thank you. I cover things such as the far left and violent extremism on the far left, which in my country as well as yours, if you talk about extremism and you mention its existence on the left and you present evidence of it, you are presented as problematic in the best light. And unfortunately, in my case, I've been targeted for a lot of violence because of my reporting. As many of the audience may be aware, America has been possessed by this ideology ever since Trump was elected, that America was now on this cusp of fascism and that anything and everything needed to be done. So things such as defunding police departments, demoralizing law enforcement, delegitimizing the criminal justice system, the rule of law, and then with that, justifying left-wing political violence as a response. That's created an environment where if you do the type of work that I do, it's unfortunately very unsafe, and the authorities are either powerless or unwilling to respond to pleas and reports of threats.
And how do they square that with the fact that you are, I guess, for them, the sort of ultimate boogeyman? You're an openly gay son of Vietnamese refugees. You are everything that they believe should agree with them. How is it that they square their attacks on you with their identity politics?
When I was first victimized by them physically in 2019, I was a bit surprised because I thought that given that their entire the surface of their ideology and statements is all about protecting various vulnerable minorities, and I fit into a number one of them. But they had no hesitation in threatening to kill me and actually making multiple attempts on my life. And I think what that shows is that the whole so-called anti-racism that they say that they abide by or try or follow, and the being for LGBTQ plus people, all that is really, it's a facade. Behind that is a extremist political ideology that has absolutely no problem with crushing and destroying anybody who's standing in its way. And it doesn't matter what your ideology or color or sexual orientation, etc. It doesn't matter what that is, they will destroy.
I don't know if you saw, Peter, but this video on Twitter of a guy who, and I think this has happened a number of times, I guess he's Asian or Vietnamese guy who was mistaken for you at a protest, and he calls the crowd out for their racism because they just assumed that this guy was you, and even though he was telling them, "I'm not Andy Ngo," that they kept insisting. And wasn't it a journalist in a bar recently who said that he'd seen you in a bar and you weren't even in the country, but he insisted on it anyway?
That's right. That's his name is Thor Benson, and his body of work includes contributions to Daily Beast, Rolling Stone, Popular Science, so a number of establishment publications, and it surprised me that a journalist who made a false claim, presented no evidence, the response from journalists was they went to me and asked me, can you prove that you weren't in New Orleans, that you weren't the person he confronted? And I don't know how I could prove that I was just in my flat on that night, and sleeping actually because of the time that he alleged it occurred. But yes, there's been numerous incidents where my detractors and those who hate me have they're so driven by hatred that they see somebody who, in their eyes, vaguely resembles me, and it's just maybe another East Asian male, and they'll confront them or mistake them. And I mean, it shows you how their racism manifests, but they're so blinded by their political
Distinct
ideology.
lack of self-awareness.
Yeah, they're not even aware of it.
But it's not actually, I mean, I read your book, obviously. We talked about it on the channel, if you remember.
Link
Andy.
below.
And I think what sort of struck me about many of these people is that it's sort of ideology they're blinded by, but there is also just blind spite and resentment and, you know, all of these things. So in fact, it's the ideology, as you say, it's not a sincere thing. It's just sort of something that they can hang all these emotions on.
In your recent conversation with Jordan Peterson, I think, when you you used a phrase when you described the attack that happened against you, did you describe it as gleeful or something? The way that these people attacked, and Jordan Peterson asked you if you would explain what you meant by that. Do you think that there is a kind of, with these people who attacked you personally, do you think there is a kind of thrill that they get from their violence?
I think so. I mean, really at its core, the ideology of, let's say, Antifa, that's what I primarily write about, it is a nihilistic violence extremist view. So yes, their violence is politically motivated, but a lot of it is carried out for the sake of bloodlust and violence and seeing things burn, literally for no other reason. And so in my interview by Jordan Peterson, I was describing actually the glee that I saw that they took in assaulting other people when I was undercover and doing ground observation work for my book. And so it was in those circumstances that I was able to be right up next to them and to see how they would laugh, and in a way that I just you read about evils of humanity in history books, what humans are capable of doing. And I guess in my mind, I was naive for much of my life, and it seemed that these are things that are closed chapters in history. And then in my line of work and in America, and seeing up close how groups of people could really relish and revel in making another person suffer in cruel ways. I mean, that's very eye-opening.
Why was it that you chose this to be, as a journalist, this to be your beat? Was there a particular motivation in choosing that? And did you realise beforehand what you were getting yourself into?
When I started off as a student journalist, I was just actually interested in writing and sharing stories that I thought and felt like my colleagues were unwilling to going to various subjects and topics that I felt my colleagues just weren't willing to go to. And that
for good reason, maybe.
Yeah. And being in Portland, then at that time I was in my graduate studies at Portland State University when Trump was elected, and my city had 3 days of rioting, and I was assigned to cover it. And that was the first time that I saw Antifa and left-wing violent extremism, like face-to-face. And the way it was covered that I saw in the local press and then the national and international press was that these were anti-fascists who were opposing the election of the fascists. And rather than the truth of the reality is these were extremists who were exploiting a fear that was drummed up by the media to carry out violence and trying to destabilize local jurisdiction, which unfortunately they've had a lot of success in doing for the next 5 years.
A lot of our viewers will be thinking this is something that the phenomenon you're describing is something that is in the US, that is perhaps less relevant to them. I know that a lot of people have read your book. It's a New York Times bestseller, but it does focus on the United States. And how big of an issue is Antifa and the ideology that Antifa subscribes to? How much of an issue is that, or a concern in the United Kingdom? And what, if you were to explain to our viewers, how this is relevant to them?
So British people will understand that your country is really the first to catch any type of ideological movements and phenomenons that take place in the United States. Really, the first place it goes to after Canada would be really the UK, and then gradually other Western European societies and countries. And so even though you haven't had the level of far less violence inspired by BLM or Antifa that the United States did, I think that your country is vulnerable because so much of the news and pop culture and political culture is it takes so much from the United States. So it's noteworthy that in 2020, I think outside of the US, it was Canada and the UK were the other two countries that had some violence break out because of George Floyd's death. So that's quite telling. And then there was also violence that happened in Bristol against a police station. And but your political system, I feel, because your common law tradition is so old and your judicial system is so entrenched into your history and culture, I feel like it's able to withstand some of the cultural pressures that are exerted from the outside. Whereas it seems like America, being a much younger country, it surprised me that sort of very foundational beliefs to American law has been challenged so strongly from within, and not with the vision to reform or to point out areas where it's weak and could improve, but rather for that of revolution, of toppling the entire thing.
I think that has been one of the most saddening and also surprising things, actually, about what's happened with this whole cultural assault over the past couple of years, is the speed with which it's happened in America, and the defunding of the police, really radical things. No one's really seriously calling for the defunding of the police here in Britain, but it has happened in America. Homicides are hugely up, aren't they? And I think that there is this change in the way in which cities feel. This is my perception anyway. Not just where you're from, but Los
San
Angeles,
Francisco,
New York, all of these places. I find myself not wanting to go particularly anymore. And I don't know about you, but America was always hugely part of my cultural hinterland. There's no question. I always adored the place, and yet it feels now significantly sort of different. One of the reasons being is that the people at the top now also espouse a mild version of this, a very, sort of a woke version of this, And it feels that the dominant things that took also your parents to America in the original instance, they are no longer the dominant culture, those sort of freedom and can-do and all of that. It seems to have very quickly changed into something entirely different.
Do you think that is from your perspective, but also from your perspective, Peter, as a Brit and as an American, what impact does that have on the so-called special relationship and on geopolitics if America is a substantively different place culturally?
But I don't know what my view. I've always been very sceptical about this special relationship thing. I think it is an historical thing, but having lived in America as well, it really exists mostly in the minds of the British, I think. I know
unrequited love affair.
Well, yes, it's not the sort of thing people maybe think I would believe, but I do think that it's something that is sort of there. It's an historic tie, yes, for sure. But I think if it was there, I think it is not really there anymore, and certainly not with people now in charge in America.
Do you think that's right? Do you think this is in the minds of Brits rather than in the minds of Americans?
Well, before I answer that, I wanted to just step back a little bit, and I wanted to make clear that I'm not trying to paint too rosy of a picture of things in the United Kingdom, even though you don't have the level of historical and contemporary left-wing domestic terrorism as the United States did, because some older viewers may remember that in the 60s and 70s, America had a number of bombings by communist revolutionaries. And that seed that they planted continues, particularly because a lot of them, after they were convicted and spent time in prison, they went on into academia to become well-respected professors, and they've been completely reintegrated into mainstream left-wing life. But I mean, in your society and in Western Europe, the issue you have here is jihadist Islamic extremism. And I'm looking in, when I look at the challenges that your counter-extremist authorities have to deal with, the number of jihadists that are imprisoned in your country, and I mean, Sweden just last week had days and days of violent rioting because of a politician who said he was going to burn the Quran. So you have a different set of challenges that also manifests itself into deadly violence, and I would say, unfortunately, has a much better track record at killing people.
I'm segueing away from my original question here, but the weekend NCF held this large St George's Day conference event.
Yes, we did.
And Eric Kaufman gave a talk talking about resisting what he calls cultural socialism, which I think is a much better
and so
term
did you.
for...
A very lucky thing, hiding a light under a bushel.
I think that's a much better way of describing the phenomenon of what most people describe as woke, because I think it's something broader and it deserves more intellectual credit for what it is than just simply calling it something glib like woke. And
I agree.
What you're describing, Andy, when you're talking about the situation in the United Kingdom, I wonder whether, firstly, when we talk about Antifa and we talk about the kind of the intellectual environment or the sort of natural habitat of Antifa, whether intellectually speaking they share that with other groups that do have more of a sort of prominence in the UK, like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter and some of these other left-wing activist groups here. Do you see those as being, cultural socialism, we can call it, as being something distinct from Antifa? Or do you think that perhaps in the United Kingdom, and you described Bristol, and I hope you don't mind me saying that both of us went down there to see what was going on. And my question is whether it's just the case that the United Kingdom, in many ways, we're sort of downstream from things that happen in the US, whether we're just at an earlier stage of development with these groups or with a potential Antifa movement here, whether you think that difference in terms of the sorts of extremism that the US has and in the United Kingdom has, whether that is a case of, two separate things, Antifa and cultural socialism, or whether there is a potential for it to spiral into a violent movement. Do you have any sort of views on at what stage we're at in the United Kingdom when it comes to far left extremism?
Well, first, the conference over last weekend was wonderful, and I think the term cultural socialism is a great term, it's a great concept, it's more clear. I never really used the term woke, and I find it quite overused, and it's I think the issue I take with the term woke is it sounds actually quite cutesy, and it doesn't really portray or communicate clearly that it's actually a very, very dangerous worldview and political ideology. Regarding Antifa's relationship with woke and these other left-wing movements that are active in the UK, I would say Antifa's violent extremism is easier to recognize because they are calling for indirect and direct attacks on the state and institutions of the state, and they call for criminality and violent criminal acts against their political opponents. So within the law, you actually already have legislation that would be able to counter and stop those who engage in those incitement to violence or carrying out the violence. We do too in the US, although we have a different issue there where prosecutors who are generally elected and political figures are choosing not to prosecute. That's a separate thing. I think what makes cultural socialists, more insidious or just as insidious. I'm not sure if worse or same threat is because they operate within the system and are doing things legally, and more so about changing the culture of various institutions of societies and in cities. That stuff is all done legally, and often when they've reached a certain saturation or dominance, you don't even realize when and how they got there. I feel like because Britain is not as far as the United States is culturally, you have sort of a case study in the US, and to say, this is why you need to organize and counter now, which I'm actually hopeful because I see figures such as J.K. Rowling and others who are speaking out in regards to trans ideology, whereas in the United States, we don't have somebody like J.K. Rowling. That discussion has already finished in the US. There was never even a debate, it seemed to me, and to a lot of Americans. One day we were just told, this trans ideology is now the orthodoxy. You do not challenge it. Mm-hmm. So here, there's still some light.
There is. I just, without wishing to be too downbeat, the big difference I think as well is in our ingrained hate speech laws, which do not exist in America in the same way. Mm-hmm. That's crucial. Mm-hmm. I mean, the kind of effect that has on free speech is easy to be seen in Britain. I mean, it's not something that it sort of just sneaks up on people. You realise that actually people are very, very careful about what they say, but they can actually be prosecuted. And hate speech is sort of growing, whether it's, through the legislature or whether it's through guidelines, police guidelines, mm-hmm. things like this, sort of growing exponentially. Because of the Constitution in America, it just isn't there. I don't think there is a single hate speech law in America. I don't think there is, not a formal one.
No, there isn't. It would be against
unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional because the First Amendment. The First Amendment obviously is lauded a lot all around the world, but there is a double-edged sword in that, for example, in the United States, the incitement to violence that is carried out by a lot of extremists is seen as protected speech. So you can have those who call for various people to die or to be killed, and they're not prosecuted because that's considered their free speech. In fact, the law, the way it's written, depending on the jurisdiction, what is considered a death threat is actually very, very specific. Whereas here, the type of things that our extremists in America are saying here would be prosecuted and have been prosecuted. It's the whole free speech thing and the law. It's complicated. It's not, and I guess maybe that can lead into a discussion into the changes that have happened at Twitter.
Perfect.
This is a very, very important point actually, because the original law, the only restriction on free speech here, until recent times, was this one of incitement to kill or violence, or whatever. That seemed to me to be fine. That was a good way of qualifying it. That pretty much you should be able to say what you like, so long as you're not inciting violence or death. That has completely gone. That whole idea has gone. But with it has gone the idea of free speech anyway. And you've only got to look at any survey now of younger people, particularly. They actively don't believe in it.
It's interesting that that is exactly Elon Musk's position when as I mentioned in the introduction, Elon Musk has basically he's bought Twitter, and the left are. Particularly the liberal left are losing their minds over it because they're worried that suddenly their opponents are no longer going to be censored, and this terrifies them. And I think it's interesting. I mean, Elon has said exactly. I'm on first name terms with him. Elon Musk, which people call him Elon or Musk. Elon Musk has said exactly this when he said he's a free speech. Advocate, a libertarian. He believes in allowing legal speech on online. So anything like incitement, obviously, or illegal content, he wouldn't be in favour of allowing. But anything that is legal to say offline, and obviously that's different if you're in the US or if you're in the UK, anything that is legal to say offline, he wants people to be able to say on Twitter, because he thinks this is something that is important not only for the future of democracy, but in his mind it seems the future of humanity itself, because he thinks that Twitter has become the public square, even though admittedly, we've talked about this before, it actually has only, hundreds of millions of users in comparison to other platforms that have
it's very
billions.
small. I think it's 213 million worldwide.
Which is actually not that many.
Not that many, not compared to Facebook or whatever, but it's just the type of people who are on it tend to be influential.
But what is particularly interesting, I think, and I, at various points over the last couple of days have noticed this, that I did an interview with Alex Phillips on GB News and waited to see what this guy from Labour List, who was on with her as a sort of presenter's friend, gave his comments afterwards. And he said the same thing that many people on the left in the UK have been saying, which is that we need to be worried about misinformation. They seem to be entirely in favour of this idea of regulating content on the internet, that somehow it's actually pro-free speech to regulate content. But I guess what I'm interested in, from your perspective, Andy, as well, is why have the left responded in this way to the decision? Because, Elon Musk is a guy who is a massive advocate for the environment. He's the pioneer of electric vehicles. He's donated to the Democratic Party. I think he donated.
Has he really?
He donated to Obama's campaign. I think his children even have gender-neutral names. He's a libertarian, but he's not. In their mind, he's just this evil troll.
He also talks about the poisonous woke mind virus. That's what's got them. He did this, was it this week? He said, this has taken over. I think he was talking about Netflix.
But why do you think that the left have responded in this way? Is it just because they are angry that their opponents are not going to be censored, that they feel that not having censorship of their opponents is somehow dangerous?
I think the vocal uproar that we've seen from leftists on social media, left-wing political commentators, left-wing politicians, and left-wing employees who work for Twitter, what it's revealing is that they view free speech as a threat. That's really what it comes down to. And I think they are, even though they're not saying it, I think what's implicit is that they recognize that Twitter and these other platforms are biased in a way systematically that benefits them. They won't admit that, but it's actually, that's the perception that a lot of people have. Elon Musk apparently seems to have that, and that's why broadly people who are conservative or right of centre have been very, very happy about Mr. Musk purchasing Twitter for $44 billion. That's, you can't even fathom really how much money that is. It's a really big deal, I think. So for years now, there's always been grumblings from the right that Twitter's been unfair. But I think what really kind of crystallized it for all of us on the conservative or centrist on the right was the way that just before the 2020 presidential US election, that Twitter had censored reporting from the New York Post about Hunter Biden that could have that it was a story that was negative to Biden, then candidate Biden. There were communications on the laptop that seemed to suggest that he was involved in these various illicit dealings around the world. And that reporting you couldn't share at the time. New York Post was unable to access its Twitter account for 2 weeks during a very, very crucial time just before the elections. And so Jack Dorsey last year at a congressional hearing went on the record and said that was a mistake. But the fact that the mistake so significantly went in one way, I don't think that was that wasn't random. Some of these communications that sources have revealed to me, and what from Twitter employees and what others have stated publicly in their own Twitter profiles. There's been meltdown for the entire month of April. They're fearful about how the culture of the Twitter company could change because it has a very, it's entirely left wing, and that's the entire makeup of big tech, and it's an issue. And you can see it also in data that's been revealed about the political affiliations of the employees who work at all these big tech companies.
Or even the algorithms. They're horrified that he might make their algorithms transparent, because then you might be able to see clearly that Twitter has a bias. I mean, you describe one particular instance of something being taken down that could affect the democratic process, but now a lot of these left-wing activists are saying we're worried that this is going to affect democracy, when they weren't worried it was going to affect democracy in their favour. These are the same people who at one point would, and this is a point that Sam Ashworth-Hayes has made, which I think is really amusing and a very good point, which is that when they were talking before about regulating content and taking things down and so on, they would use the argument that, well, it's a private business, they can do whatever they like. But now they're throwing their toys out of the pram because Elon Musk might just do something that they don't agree with, but it's a private business and Elon Musk can do what he likes, no?
Yes, exactly. I think what this shows, we see it in so many different areas actually of life, but certainly in this particular instance, is the complete authoritarianism of the left, in that I really don't think people on the right, or conservative right, call it what you want, they generally don't try and shut people down from saying something. They might usually disagree, but it's never been a thing. But there really is this impulse on the left, particularly these days. I don't think it was always the case, but particularly now, it's to close down, or indeed, you know, speaking of Twitter, I was very amused by something that Sadiq Khan put on Twitter. You know, I think he must have been in relation to Elon Musk taking it over, and he sort of said something like, "Free speech should never be a gateway for hate speech," or something like this. Well, we know that, you know. So why is the only time you say anything about free speech to bring up hate speech?
Yeah, for them, free speech is hate speech.
Why is it? Yes. Why is it the only time you never see them defending or saying the wonderful thing about free speech? No, it's always that somehow this is going to open the floodgates, you know, to bigotry and all the rest of it. I find it very interesting, you know, and similarly, when the way that they've been sort of literally, sort of as you say, in meltdown, is this kind of fear of hearing another point of view, or letting other people hear it.
Like Rosie Jones, they're all having an angry cry.
Exactly, having an angry cry.
Do you think that this is going to be good for the future of Twitter? Or do you agree with some who have said, for example, that it's not a good idea for one person to own something like Twitter and to be in control of the whole thing? Or like Jeff Bezos, strangely, as a side point, Jeff Bezos put this tweet up, retweeting something suggesting that in Elon Musk's Tesla batteries, I think it is, get manufactured in China, and it was somebody questioning whether or not this would mean that Twitter would somehow be beholden to the Chinese. And Jeff Bezos put this tweet up, and he asked a question about it, and then this has been repeated in the Times, in the Telegraph, as if Jeff Bezos is casting doubt on whether maybe Elon Musk might be under the thumb of the Chinese. But then in the tweet underneath that, it actually says that he doesn't think that Elon Musk will be. He says that he thinks it's unlikely and so on. But the media just acted as if that second tweet didn't exist and that no one was going to go and read it, and have just been reporting on the first half of that tweet. It almost, I'm not being conspiratorial, I just think that I don't know whether this is a conscious or an unconscious bias. I don't know whether they have the self-awareness or it's some kind of sort of cognitive mechanism that they're just ignoring like a Procrustean bed, they're just ignoring the things that are inconvenient to them. But there does seem to be this desire to, I suppose, to question the wisdom of Elon Musk just as one businessman taking over taking over the entirety of a company like Twitter. Do you think it's going to be good for Twitter? Do you think it's going to be a sort of something that is, sounds grandiose, but good for the future of humanity? Or do you think that that there could be negative consequences that people on our side are not necessarily recognising because we're like, yippee, free speech, this is fantastic, and maybe we're not noticing that there could be some other things there that maybe might not be so great?
People have said this with Murdoch, and we shouldn't have, or people shouldn't, foreigners shouldn't own domestic media. I don't really know what I think about this, actually. I mean, all I can say is that I thought it was good news about Elon Musk, because every other social media platform instinctively are pretty much kind of opposed to my views, and whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it is.
Certainly Jeff Bezos.
Yes, and you just sort of think, well, actually, maybe this is just a bit of a evening out, an evening out of things. So I don't mind from that point of view.
Do you think?
I think Elon Musk's desire to make Twitter a more fairer and accessible town square, I think that's a genuine motivation for him getting first buying the largest number of shares, and then now taking over the entire company. However, I think ultimately once the transition and the changes that happen, once it settles down, I think both the left and right will be disappointed for different reasons. The right will probably, if they're hoping for really dramatic changes, I don't think it's probably unlikely to come for a number of reasons. One, the content moderation is going to it's going to stay there regardless, because in order for Twitter to be able to operate in much of the world, you have to take off illegal content, various, pornographic material that, is illegal, or death threats. And he's taking out a large loan to be able to finance this purchase, and so has an interest, of course, to continue to see Twitter financially viable as well. And if Twitter was to become like a 4chan or something where there was like really no moderation, you just get it's unusable, and there's a reason why some of these other platforms that don't have really any moderation don't become commercially viable, and they just I think all the people on the left who are screaming about the sky falling, they're probably going to find that actually much of what they want to stay the same on Twitter would still be there. But this is my prediction.
Isn't it sort of some of the other ones that have been created, not least of all Trump's one? What's it called now? Social
Truth.
And there've been a number. I mean, I wonder what they feel about it, because their whole kind of sort of offer is about not being Twitter, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought they would quite like. I would have thought they needed Twitter to remain the way it was to work, actually. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of suddenly people like me thinking, oh, that's good, is not a good thing.
Perhaps. I don't know, do you think?
These other platforms that popped up in competition to Twitter explicitly came into existence because its founders felt that Twitter was unfair and biased. So, I mean, if Twitter...
And it may continue to be.
It may continue to be, but I mean, Twitter, I think, becomes the vision that Elon Musk has. It's going to pose a challenge for these other platforms that are new and trying to grow. Elon
Musk, though, he's a big thinker. Anybody who's worked with him, if you look at some of the, over the last couple of days, there have been a lot of sources from people who've worked with him at various points saying, what he's like to work with and what kind of character he is and what kind of intellect he is. And the thing that really stands out seems to be that this is a man whose primary goal is not making money, strangely enough, for the world's richest man, but it's to do with the future of humanity. That's the thing that really drives him. And he's, the man behind Neuralink, this successful attempt, it seems, to connect computers to animal brains. He's the guy behind SpaceX. Apparently, he knew nothing about rockets, and then within no time at all, he knew everything about rockets. He's concerned.
Are there no end to this man's talents?
Well, it's more that he's concerned with what seems to me to be. I'm not sort of flattering Elon Musk, but the bigger picture here is that he's a joined-up thinker. And he's going for the things that he believes will be at the cutting edge. And he's made the decision to invest, as you say, to take out a huge loan to invest in Twitter because he believes that it's important to democracy and that free speech and that this platform is presumably at the cutting edge. So my question would be, looking at his joined-up thinking, Twitter gives you an awful lot of information about people. For somebody who's interested in the nexus between machines and the human mind, wants to put man on Mars, he's a sci-fi thinker ultimately. And people who are often concerned about libertarian issues and free speech are very often also concerned about privacy issues. Is it possible that one of the reasons why Elon Musk is so interested in Twitter is because it is the place that makes the news, even though it's a tiny number of people on there. It is the sort of the hub of all of the trending ideas in the world, where all of the sort of biggest platform speakers are interacting with each other. That might actually be something that he believes is a useful tool to him in his other endeavours as well.
It could well be. I mean, it could well be. It's interesting in that case because it makes it very, very important. In a way that we tend not to think of Twitter as being important, actually. I know we've had this argument personally before, but I mean, I'm from a generation where Twitter is something I kind of do, and I do it in the morning and that's about it. I put one up, I know you use it a hell of a lot more, don't you? But basically, I've got a skepticism about the importance of Twitter on the electoral process, on democracy, for example. Always bring out this same anecdote, but it's true. Number of people I've known who have got huge followings on Twitter and think that it's somehow going to translate into support at an election. It just doesn't. It just stays there. So I've always sort of therefore thought it's important, but not quite so much. You tend to suggest, therefore, by that he thinks it's far more important.
I think he sees something in Twitter. He must do, because he's not. I think I read somewhere that they didn't describe it as a folly, but as some kind of pet project. He's not just picking this up because he cares about Twitter's failing business model because it's not particularly profitable or anything like that. Do you think that this is one of the reasons why he is interested in Twitter, that he views it as part of this bigger picture of understanding the human mind and pushing the frontiers of humanity? Sounds very grandiose put in those terms, doesn't it?
Well, every journalist will understand the importance of Twitter in, one, breaking news, and shaping narratives. And though the majority of the population is not on Twitter, the majority of the population consume news in some form, and the legacy and new media all rely on Twitter to have a degree, or to some degree anyways. So
reporting tweets like the Jeff Bezos one.
So, I mean, yes, Twitter has a big effect in democracy, which is why Democrats in America have been so keen on leaning on big tech to carry out the censorship that they otherwise are unable to do in legislation because of the First Amendment. But by the way, as excited as I am about this Elon Musk and Twitter, it's my optimism's dampened a bit, because I think if Elon is, let's say the best course of action is that Twitter does become much more free speech friendly, then I think you're going to see legislation come out, particularly out of the EU, as it's already had, to counter that. And you can't, you can pull out of, Twitter it's fine with not operating in North Korea or something like that, but not operating in the EU because it doesn't comply with EU legislation on social media and misinformation and hate speech. Yeah.
Can I ask, both of you actually, if you had to lose, say, for example, if you had to lose, I don't know, the San Francisco Chronicle or the Los Angeles Times or whatever, if it had to be Twitter or that, what would you see go?
You mean mainstream media or
yes,
social
or
media?
sort of like the papers that you grew up watching, looking at. In terms of your work and even as people, what would be more of a loss to you?
Twitter. I didn't even have to think
Twitter,
about it. Yeah.
So
well, I mean, I grew up with the Romford Recorder, so
well, no.
no dissing to the Romford
Nothing
Recorder.
wrong with the Romford, but the thing is, nothing wrong with that at all. But I suppose that supposing it was sort of the things that informed my micro, the Spectator, the Economist, all of those sorts of things, New Statesman, blah blah blah. On the one hand, and the newspapers and Twitter. So it would
But there's a very particular reason for my answer, because I think in the past, journalists, for the most part, they did the sort of excavating work.
Yeah, investigating.
Whereas now, I think actually a lot of the media, a lot of the mainstream media, reports on social media. And they let themselves be led by social media. As I mentioned, the Times using that Jeff Bezos tweet, that it's actually Twitter, for the most part, that sets the news agenda. And you can get a lot of that news quicker and faster by going straight to Twitter, because that, for many journalists, is the source. And that's a source that is available to any citizen who uses Twitter.
Well, some of the things that you post on Twitter, Andy, I mean, am I right to say that actually you report on general crime as well now in America, in cities? And some of the clips you put up, I mean, have genuinely taken me aback, and I've sure enough retweet them and all the rest of it. And I don't think that many of them would even get into the mainstream
But even
press.
then, it's not just social media, though, because you have a Substack, many people, and a newsletter, the No-Go Zone.
That's on Locals.
Locals, yeah. So, I mean, Twitter is connected to all of these other. The people that you follow on Twitter will be on things like Locals, will have Substacks, and in many cases you can receive directly from journalists that fresh, hot off the press information that might not otherwise be found in a mainstream news source. It doesn't mean to say that those mainstream news sources that do the traditional work of journalism, that you feel confident, that you can trust, that you don't still go to those sources and put things side by side. But I do feel like Twitter, at least for me, I view it as a tool for work, and obviously you need to apply your critical faculties to. But
what about you, Andy? What do you think, looking at them? Looking at the two, I know maybe it's a false dichotomy, but you know what I'm saying. Which could you not live without?
I don't know if I could pick. My record is I've been very vocally critical of establishment media, but at the end of the day, they do invest in the resources, the journalists, the talent, and the time to break stories that take a lot of work, that is difficult for an amateur or an average layperson to break. And people can criticize the tone, the narrative, the angle, the bias of whatever stories, but they are moving the needle. They are breaking stories. And I'm talking about the establishment papers, Washington Post and New York Times, papers that I have a lot of issues with, and who I find many of the journalists are extremely biased and unprofessional. But nonetheless, they write stories, they break stories. Twitter removes all the gatekeeping, which on the one hand is really wonderful. I was able to gain a large following and to grow because I was able to build up my own brand, and people were able to evaluate if my tweets were interesting or informative, and they would follow me. But at the same time, I saw firsthand how Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube were used, for example, to spread disinformation and misinformation to amplify the BLM narrative that Black people were victims of a genocide in America, and to incite a certain hatred and reaction enough that people take to the streets and either carry out acts of violence or support it. So that's the other thing, there's so for the people out there who are saying, they want to get rid of all censorship or content moderation, it's really not. It's not realistic. It can actually be really destabilizing because the truth doesn't always win out. In fact, you and I can all find examples every day on Twitter from prominent people who are supposed to be trustworthy, posting information that is untrue, and it goes viral.
And very often things that are dubbed misinformation turn out not to be misinformation, because who is the gatekeeper who makes that decision? So, like when at various points during the pandemic, misinformation was defined by what the World Health Organization were doing, but then they made U-turns on particular things, or whatever the local health authorities were saying, but then the local health authorities couldn't make their minds up about what was good and what was bad and what was true and what wasn't, and it changed month on month. So I'm aware that we're running slightly over time, and there are a few things that I want to ask you about beforehand. So just very quickly, some final thoughts on what do you both think this means for big tech, because this is being painted as a really, really huge story, and we've been talking about the way that left-wingers and employees as well have been sort of throwing their toys out of the pram over this. Do you think this is as big a story as it's being made out to be? Do you think that this is going to have huge ramifications for the big tech world overall?
It's a huge story because this is the first big crack on the left-wing cultural dominance in big tech. And up until now, they've essentially have been immune to any challenges. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that this made me inspire other brave people like Elon Musk to put money where their mouths are, because most billionaires are not willing to do what Elon did, and I hope there is a cultural shift in the culture of Twitter, and that can inspire the other companies in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, excuse me, it's obviously important. It took the richest man in the world to do it. It would actually be, as we've said so many times before on this channel, it would be, I think, the way forward in the end for people of our views broadly is to build our own things. Whether it is like we've seen with the Daily Wire recently, starting children's content because of what Disney is doing. That is, I think, going to be the way. Mm-hmm. We won't be able to rely, there's only one richest man in the world, and he's just done something. So I think
he had to take out a loan.
Oh, he had to take out, he probably didn't have to take out a loan. I imagine that was probably
didn't he? 20 billion?
Yes, 20, he did. He did, but he probably didn't need to. It's probably quite good housekeeping.
I imagine his money's probably tied up in other things.
Yes, exactly.
Well, at the end of the day, money matters. You don't have to be the world's richest man to do what Elon did. George Soros is not the world's richest man, and you can see where his money has been able to really affect the culture and politics of not just the United States, but many, many, many countries. So the way the things are right now, it's, money matters.
So quickly, before we unfortunately have to tie things up, I want to talk to you very briefly about this announcement that Google Docs, or Google, has released this assisted writing tool, which basically instructs you on, with autocorrect and so on how to use more inclusive language. So I don't know if you remember that weird paperclip Microsoft assistant that used to make annoying suggestions while you were trying to write. Yeah. This is a kind of a woke version of that, in the sense that it suggests changing things like blacklist to deny list, or mailman to mail carrier, manned to crewed. Anything that is regarded as potentially discriminatory or whatever, if people want to make their writing, their emails, whatever for work more inclusive. Just quickly, what are your thoughts on this?
It's just absurd and horrendous. Just should be ignored.
Do you agree with the people who think that this is overblown? Because obviously this is a tool you don't have to use. But then at the same time, people like who I'm inclined usually to agree with, like Silky Carlo from Big Brother Watch, has come out saying that this is creepy. This is an attempt to control the way people use language and so on. Are we seeing, to use the overused phrase, Orwellian? Is this just the latest in a kind of Orwellian attempt to change the way that people think by changing the way that they use language?
On its own, it's just a drop, but it's a drop among now what is a downpour of attempts to shift the English language in a very artificial and less clear way. I mean, if you're using a lot of euphemisms, you're speaking less clearly, and it's done for a political reason. I would say that in totality with other things such as programming on TikTok, whatever, I mean, this is really affects the language of the younger generations, and you can really see it when you interact with teens and children today who have been educated now entirely in the world of social media and online platforms.
Oh yes, even actually the word you were using when you say, to discriminate, using that word, that has entirely changed the meaning of that word. That discriminate meant to be discriminating was meant to be a good thing. It showed taste and whatever, and you should have discrimination in your thought. Now it's totally changed its meaning. When you use that word, like you used it there in its right context, many younger people will say, well, how dare you discriminate? What do you mean? They've only seen it in one sense now. So I think, yes,
it's the tyranny of judgmental relativism.
Yes.
So on that note, I like the analogy there of a drop amongst a downpour. We're going to have to wrap things up. We didn't get to talking about the conference, which
next
has
time, don't worry.
Some of the videos of that. Hopefully, all of the videos of that will be going up online soon. And maybe in the next episode we can discuss some of the speeches from that as well, and maybe by then some of that will be online. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks so much.
And please like and subscribe. Comment down below to let us know your thoughts, and we will see you next time on Newspeak. Thank you for watching.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.